always been a beloved tradition for Liam and his friends. They relished the quiet escape from the hustle of city life, the smell of pine trees, the crackle of the campfire, and the simple joy of sleeping under the stars. This year, the group had chosen a remote camping spot in Colorado, a place far from civilization, nestled deep within a sprawling forest that stretched for miles in every direction. The trip began like any other. Liam, his girlfriend Clara, and their two closest friends, Marcus and Ava, packed their gear and hiked several miles into the forest. They carried everything they needed for a 3-day trip: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, and a map marked with their destination. The spot they chose was perfect, an open clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a small creek bubbling nearby. The first night passed without incident. They spent hours laughing around the fire, telling ghost stories, and roasting marshmallows. As the fire died down and the stars twinkled above, they crawled into their tents, lulled to sleep by the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. But the second night was different. It started with the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Liam was the first to notice, his head tilting slightly as he strained to hear. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low. The group fell silent, ears pricked. For a moment, there was nothing but the usual sounds of the forest: crickets chirping, the creek gurgling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, there it was again, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on dried leaves. "It's probably just an animal," Marcus said, though his tone lacked conviction. Clara, who had always been the most cautious of the group, frowned. "An animal would avoid us with all this noise and fire. Don't you think?" They brushed it off, returning to their conversation, though the mood was noticeably subdued. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, the footsteps grew louder. This time, they were unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and circling the campsite. Ava clutched her flashlight nervously. "Okay, that's not an animal," she whispered. Liam stood, grabbing his own flashlight and shining it into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but the dense forest. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" No answer. "Maybe it's another camper," Clara suggested, though her voice trembled. "In the middle of nowhere?" "Doubt it," Marcus replied, pulling out a small hunting knife he always carried on trips. The group huddled closer together, the fire casting flickering shadows around them. For the next hour, the footsteps continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always moving. They called out several times, but no one responded. Eventually, the noises stopped. Relieved but still uneasy, the group decided to call it a night. They doused the fire, double-checked their gear, and retreated into their tents. Liam lay awake for hours, listening intently for any sound. When none came, he finally drifted into a restless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, he woke to a faint rustling outside the tent. His heart pounded as he strained to listen. The sound was close, right outside. "Clara," he whispered, nudging her awake. "Do you hear that?" She blinked groggily, then froze as the noise reached her ears. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was breathing, slow, heavy, and deliberate. Someone or something was standing just outside their tent. Liam's first instinct was to grab his flashlight, but Clara stopped him, shaking her head frantically. They lay motionless, barely daring to breathe, as the sound of breathing grew louder. It moved around the tent, pausing at the entrance. Then the zipper moved. It wasn't being yanked open, just tugged, slowly, as if someone was testing it. Liam's hand clenched around a camping knife he had stashed nearby. Just as he was about to act, the sound stopped. The breathing faded, and whoever or whatever, it was moved away. For the rest of the night, they didn't hear another sound. Morning brought a sense of relief. The sunlight felt like a shield against the terror of the night. The group emerged from their tents, exchanging nervous glances. "Did anyone else hear something last night?" Marcus asked. Ava nodded, her face pale. "I thought I saw someone, a shadow just outside my tent. I kept my eyes shut and pretended to sleep." Liam and Clara shared their story, and the group decided to investigate the area. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the forest floor littered with leaves and twigs. But near the edge of the clearing, they found something that made their blood run cold. Footprints. Large, bare footprints. Too large to belong to any of them and too human to be an animal. The prints circled the campsite and led into the forest, where they disappeared. "Okay, we're leaving," Clara said firmly. The group packed up in record time, abandoning their plans to stay another night. As they hiked back to the trailhead, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Several times, Liam thought he saw movement in the trees, a dark figure slipping between the trunks. But whenever he turned to look, it was gone. By the time they reached their car, the group was exhausted and shaken. They didn't speak much on the drive home, each lost in their own thoughts. Liam couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. Who or what had been out there with them? Was it a deranged person living off the grid? A prankster trying to scare them? Or something far more sinister? He didn't have an answer, and maybe that was the most terrifying part. To this day, Liam refuses to go camping again. Whenever someone asks him why, he simply says, "The forest isn't always as empty as you think." And in the darkest hours of the night, when he's alone with his thoughts, he sometimes wonders if that shadow is still out there, waiting for its next group of unsuspecting campers. Emily was an experienced solo hiker. She had been traversing trails and camping alone for years, finding peace and solace in nature. For her, the wilderness was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the chaos of everyday life. So, when she decided to hike and camp near a remote lake deep in the Oregon wilderness, she felt no fear, only excitement. The lake wasn't on any major trail. It was tucked away in a dense forest, accessible only after hours of trekking through rugged terrain. That isolation was what Emily craved. She wanted silence, stillness, and the chance to be utterly alone with her thoughts. She set out early, her backpack loaded with supplies. The hike was challenging, but the crisp mountain air and breathtaking scenery made it worth every step. By late afternoon, she reached the lake, and it was even more beautiful than she had imagined. Crystal clear water stretched before her, surrounded by towering pines and jagged cliffs. Emily chose a spot near the water's edge to pitch her tent. She built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The lake reflected the fiery colors of the sunset, and for a while, she felt perfectly content. As the sky darkened, Emily noticed something unusual. Across the lake on the opposite shore, there was a small clearing she hadn't seen before. A figure was there, a man setting up a campsite. At first, Emily was annoyed. She had come all this way for solitude, only to find someone else had the same idea. Still, she told herself it wasn't a big deal. The lake was large, and the man was far enough away that they wouldn't bother each other. He waved at her, and she hesitated before waving back. There was something about the way he moved that unsettled her. His wave was slow and deliberate, almost too formal, as if he was mocking her. She couldn't make out his face in the fading light, but she shrugged it off. "It's fine," she muttered to herself. "He's probably just another hiker." After all, it wasn't uncommon to run into the occasional camper, even in remote areas. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The forest was unusually quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. She lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the roof of her tent, listening for any sound. Then she heard it, a faint scream. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. The scream was muffled and distant, but unmistakable. It had come from the direction of the man's campsite. Grabbing her flashlight, Emily unzipped her tent and stepped outside. She shone the beam across the lake, searching for any sign of movement. The other campsite was dark, with no firelight or activity. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. For a moment, she debated hiking over to check on the man, but the idea of crossing the dense forest in the dark filled her with dread. Instead, she stayed where she was, her flashlight trained on the other side of the lake. Then she saw it. The man was standing at the edge of the water, staring directly at her. Emily froze. He didn't move, didn't call out. He just stood there, his figure silhouetted against the darkness. What are you doing?" she shouted. Still no response. Her hand shook as she kept the flashlight pointed at him. She wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but hiking through the forest alone at night was even more dangerous than staying put. Eventually, the man turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. Emily stayed awake, clutching a small knife, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, she hurried to pack up her gear, determined to leave the lake behind as quickly as possible. Before heading out, she decided to check the other campsite. Maybe the man had some kind of emergency, or maybe she had imagined the whole thing in her panic. When she reached the clearing, her blood ran cold. There was no campsite, no tent, no fire pit, no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. The ground was undisturbed, covered in pine needles and moss. Emily stood there for a long time, her mind racing. She knew what she had seen. She had waved at the man, watched him set up his tent, and heard the scream. It wasn't possible for him to vanish without a trace. Shaken, she began her hike back to the trailhead. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Several times, she stopped and looked over her shoulder, convinced she saw movement in the trees. But every time she turned, there was nothing there. When she finally reached her car, Emily felt a wave of relief. She threw her gear in the back seat, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as she could. It wasn't until she was back home, safe and sound, that she decided to look up the area. A quick search revealed something that made her stomach drop. Over the past decade, several hikers and campers had gone missing near that lake. Most were never found, and the few bodies that were recovered showed no signs of foul play. Just bizarre circumstances, like perfectly intact tents or gear left behind. Emily never went camping alone again. To this day, she doesn't know what she encountered at the lake. A trick of her mind? A fellow camper with sinister intentions? Or something far more unexplainable? She only knows one thing for sure: whatever she saw or thought she saw will haunt her for the rest of her life. Josh and Eric had been best friends since childhood, bonded by their shared love for the outdoors. Every summer, they planned an adventure, a fishing trip, a hike, or a camping excursion to explore new places and escape the routines of daily life. This year, they decided on a weekend camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. Their destination was Whispering Pines, an isolated camping spot known for its serene beauty. The place was off the beaten path, requiring a 3-hour hike through dense forest to reach. Josh had read glowing reviews online about the quietness of the area, and Eric was eager to test out his new camping gear. The duo arrived at the trailhead early Saturday morning, armed with backpacks, fishing poles, and enough supplies to last the weekend. They joked and laughed as they trekked through the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. By late afternoon, they reached Whispering Pines. The campsite was even more breathtaking than they had imagined. A clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, with a crystal-clear stream cutting through the middle. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh pine needles. "This is perfect," Josh said, dropping his pack. "Totally worth the hike," Eric agreed. They set up their tents, built a small fire, and spent the evening fishing by the stream. By nightfall, they were sitting around the fire, eating their catch and swapping stories. The sky was a blanket of stars, and everything seemed perfect. But as the fire began to die down, they noticed something strange. It started with the stillness. The cheerful chirping of birds had stopped. The rustling of leaves in the breeze was gone. Even the babble of the stream seemed quieter. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Is it just me? Or is it really quiet all of a sudden?" Josh asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded, looking around uneasily. "Yeah, it's weird." Even the bugs stopped. They sat in silence, straining to hear anything. Then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the trees behind their campsite, steady and deliberate. "Woodpecker," Josh suggested, though his tone was uncertain. "Woodpeckers don't tap like that at night," Eric replied. The tapping continued, growing louder. It seemed to echo, as if it was bouncing off the trees. Josh grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the forest. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only the trunks of trees and thick underbrush. "Hello," Josh called out. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as Josh lowered the flashlight, they heard a different sound. Laughter. It was soft and high-pitched, like the giggle of a child, and it sent chills racing down their spines. "That's not funny," Eric said, his voice shaking. "I didn't laugh," Josh replied, his grip tightening on the flashlight. They stood frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped, and the forest was silent once more. "Let's just go to bed," Eric said finally, his voice tight. "It's probably some kids messing with us." Josh hesitated but eventually agreed. They doused the fire, zipped themselves into their tents, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, Josh woke up. At first, he wasn't sure why. The forest was still eerily quiet, and his tent was dark except for the faint glow of the moon. He lay still, listening intently, when he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was closer this time, right outside his tent. Josh's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the knife he kept in his bag, gripping it tightly as the tapping continued, circling the tent. "Eric," he whispered. There was no response. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. In its place came a new sound, the zipper of his tent slowly sliding down. Josh sat up, heart pounding, knife in hand. He held his breath as the zipper moved inch by inch, the cold night air seeping into the tent. When the zipper was halfway down, it stopped. Josh waited, knife raised, but nothing happened. Gathering his courage, he lunged forward and yanked the tent flap open, shining his flashlight into the darkness. There was no one there. He stepped outside, scanning the campsite. Eric's tent was zipped shut, and everything appeared undisturbed. But as Josh turned to look at the forest, his flashlight caught something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its face pale and featureless, as though it had been stretched too tightly over a skull. his head tilted slightly as if studying him. Josh stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Eric!" he screamed. The figure didn't move. Eric burst out of his tent moments later, holding a hatchet. "What's going on?" Josh pointed toward the trees, but the figure was gone. There was someone right there, he stammered. Eric shone his flashlight at the spot but saw nothing. "Are you sure? Maybe it was a shadow or something." "It wasn't a shadow," Josh insisted. Despite his fear, Eric convinced him to stay until morning. The two huddled together, weapons in hand, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, they packed up their gear in record time and started the hike back to the trailhead. Josh couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every so often, he glanced over his shoulder. As they reached the edge of the forest and the parking lot came into view, Eric stopped suddenly. "Josh," he said, his voice trembling. "Look." Josh turned and followed Eric's gaze. On a tree just a few feet away, deep gouges had been carved into the bark. They formed a single word: "Stay." Josh and Eric didn't speak another word until they were safely in the car, speeding away from whispering pines. Neither of them ever returned to the forest, and to this day, they can't explain what they encountered. But Josh swears that as they drove away, he saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them leave.